You people are always late. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as the words echoed off the walls. Judge Carter, a stern white man with a reputation for zero tolerance, didn't even glance up from the paperwork. The young black woman standing before him didn't flinch, but her eyes hardened just slightly. She said nothing, yet behind that silence, there was a storm brewing. On an ordinary Tuesday morning, a routine traffic case became the center of an explosive courtroom drama, one that would raise questions about bias, assumptions, and power dynamics in the justice system. What Judge Carter didn't know was that the woman he was dismissing with contempt was no ordinary defendant. She was Assistant U.S. Attorney Lena Wright, and she was about to teach him a lesson no law book could. The morning air was thick with humidity as Lena Wright maneuvered her black sedan through the winding roads of Crestwood, a sleepy, predominantly white town tucked just outside the city. The drive was familiar. She'd made it countless times to check on her ailing mother, who lived alone in a modest brick house just past the county line. But today, Lena's mind wasn't on her destination. Her thoughts were stuck on the crisp yellow ticket folded neatly in her glove compartment. A citation that, in her view, shouldn't have been written in the first place. It happened 3 weeks ago. She'd been driving at a steady pace down Maple Ridge Avenue when a patrol car pulled out suddenly from the shadows of a gas station. The lights flashed blue and red behind her, and her stomach dropped, not out of fear, but out of pure frustration. She glanced at her speedometer. 37 in a 35. Technically over, sure, but barely. The officer, middle-aged, white, and with a rigid practice scowl, approached her window like he'd already decided she was guilty. No small talk, no explanation, just a demand for license and registration. She complied, hands visible, voice calm. Years of training had taught her how to navigate these encounters. She never mentioned her job. It had become a personal rule. Don't throw your title around unless you need to. You were speeding, the officer grunted as he scribbled on his notepad. By how much, sir? Enough. That was the entire exchange. She considered arguing, but the dismissive tone in his voice told her it would be pointless. The citation was already half written before he approached her car. Back home later that night, she examined the ticket under the harsh light of her kitchen. It was sloppily written. No radar evidence cited, time and date slightly off, and a location that didn't quite make sense. She could have paid the fine online in minutes, but something about it bothered her more than usual. It wasn't the money. It was the principle. She was a federal prosecutor, used to dealing with cartel cases, wire fraud, and deep cover operations. But in that moment, she wasn't Assistant U.S. Attorney Lena Wright. She was just another black woman pulled over and penalized without explanation. And it hit her that if this officer could get away with that here, how many others had? She decided to challenge it in court. A week later, she filed her intention to dispute the citation. The court clerk she spoke to on the phone seemed surprised. Most folks just pay and move on, he said with a chuckle. She simply replied, I'm not most folks. He didn't ask what she meant. Now, here she was, navigating the unfamiliar roads of Crestwood once again. This time not as a daughter, but as a defendant. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her career preparing criminal cases, standing confidently in federal courtrooms, cross-examining hardened criminals, and addressing judges with sharp poise. Yet today, she would stand on the other side of the bench, facing a man who knew nothing about her, just a name on a docket. She arrived at the courthouse 15 minutes early, parking near the back where the asphalt had cracked and curled. The courthouse itself was a small, red-bricked building that looked more like a post office than a seat of justice. Inside, the fluorescent lighting hummed softly, and the smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. She checked in with the clerk, a young woman who looked up briefly before typing Lena's name into the system. "You're in courtroom 2, she said flatly. "Judge Carter." He doesn't like late arrivals. Lena gave a small nod and walked toward the double doors of Courtroom 2, her heels clicking against the polished linoleum floor. She had no intention of being late, but as she approached, a man carrying a tall stack of files brushed past her, causing her to drop her folder. A quick exchange of apologies, a few precious seconds lost. She entered the courtroom precisely 2 minutes past the hour. The room was already in session. Judge Carter sat perched high behind the bench, his robe crisp and collar starched. He looked up briefly, expression unreadable, before glancing back at his papers. "You people are always late," he muttered, clearly loud enough for everyone to hear. The room fell into a hush. A few heads turned. The bailiff, a young white man, glanced at Lena and then at the judge, as if silently questioning whether he'd heard correctly. Lena stood silently, her case file tucked firmly under her arm. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Years of dealing with egos far worse than Judge Carter's had trained her in patience. But something inside her shifted. Not anger, no, not yet. Just awareness of where she was, of how quickly assumptions had already been made. She made her way to the defendant's table. No one in the room knew her name. No one knew her title. And she had no intention of telling them. At least, not yet. Not until the moment was right. The room was still tense as Lena Wright took her place at the defendant's table, her every movement composed, deliberate. She opened her folder and removed the citation, along with a few annotated documents she'd prepared the night before. She didn't need to prepare. She knew the law cold, but organization gave her peace. It was also part of her discipline. In the courtroom, perception was power, and she never allowed hers to slip. Judge Carter, still scanning the docket sheet, didn't look up. Case number 41582. Right, Lena. Traffic violation. Exceeding posted speed limit by 5 miles per hour. He read it with mechanical indifference, like it was beneath him. His voice lacked inflection, devoid of curiosity. Lena stood, calm and confident. "Good morning, Your Honor." Judge Carter finally lifted his gaze. His eyes paused on her for just a moment too long. She knew that look. It was the squint of judgment, of sizing up. She'd seen it in interrogation rooms, in jury selection, and, more often than not, in small-town courts where she wasn't wearing the title of Assistant U.S. Attorney like a badge. "You're the driver?" the judge asked, as though surprised. "Yes, Your Honor." "You look young for someone with such poise." He said it almost as a compliment, but it had the jagged edge of condescension. Lena didn't respond. She didn't need to. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair and gave a long sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Let's move this along. What do you have to say for yourself, Ms. Wright?" There it was again. Say for yourself. As though she were a schoolchild called to the principal's office, not a woman standing in a court of law to assert her rights. She adjusted her tone to stay even, respectful. "Your Honor, I intend to contest the citation. I've reviewed the ticket and believe there are multiple inconsistencies, including a timestamp error, unclear location, and no radar evidence noted. I also have dashcam footage from my vehicle, should the court permit it to be entered into consideration." Judge Carter blinked. "Footage?" "Yes, sir." He chuckled once, humorlessly. "Most people don't prepare PowerPoint presentations for speeding tickets, Ms. Wright. I don't take being wrongly accused lightly." That landed. A shift passed through the room. A subtle one, but present. The clerk glanced up. The bailiff narrowed his eyes. Even the older man sitting in the gallery, likely there for a completely unrelated case, raised an eyebrow. Judge Carter, however, didn't appreciate the tone. "Well," he said, sitting forward, "this isn't a federal court. We don't have all the bells and whistles. You can say what you want, but at the end of the day, this is a 5-mile-per-hour violation in a 35 zone. And you were late. That doesn't bode well for your credibility. There it was again. The emphasis on lateness. 2 minutes, and yet he wielded it like a gavel. Sir, the courtroom clock read 10:01 when I entered. I was delayed momentarily in the hallway due to... Judge Carter raised a hand to cut her off. Don't make excuses. I've heard enough of those to last me a lifetime. Next time, plan better. Lena drew in a slow breath and nodded. Not in agreement, but in restraint. This was no longer about a speeding ticket. It was about the air in the room, the assumption in his tone, the undercurrent of superiority in every dismissive word. He scribbled something on the paper in front of him, then looked up again. This is a waste of the court's time. Most people own up to their mistakes and move on. Respectfully, Your Honor, Lena replied, her voice steel under velvet. I didn't make a mistake. I was within a reasonable speed margin, and I was cited without probable cause. I believe I have the right to defend myself against that. Judge Carter's lips tightened. You've made your point. Let's proceed. And then he did something that told Lena all she needed to know about the judge's bias. He reached for a rubber stamp, the kind used to approve standard motions, and slammed it down on her paperwork before she had finished speaking. His voice was cold. Fine stands. Case closed. It was abrupt. No review of her evidence. No viewing of the footage. No acknowledgement of her legal reasoning or offer to clarify. Lena stood there, perfectly still, as the judge turned to the next name on the docket. That's when it became crystal clear. He didn't care who she was. Or worse, he thought he already knew. And she intended to let him think exactly that. For now. Lena remained standing for a beat longer than expected after Judge Carter stamped the paperwork and shifted his attention to the next case. It was a subtle act of defiance. Not enough to draw a reprimand, but enough to make a point. You may have ended this hearing, but this isn't over. She turned, collected her documents with unhurried precision, and walked calmly to the courtroom doors. But instead of leaving, she took a seat in the back row, near a quiet, balding man who had watched the exchange with growing interest. She didn't look around or speak. She simply sat, present, deliberate, unshaken. Judge Carter noticed. He paused after glancing toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if annoyed that she hadn't slunk out in defeat like most defendants. Her calm refusal to show frustration or shame had unbalanced the rhythm of his courtroom. And he didn't like it. As the next few traffic cases were read, mostly fines for expired tags, rolling stops, and minor infractions, Lena sat silently, her posture upright, her face composed. But inside, she was taking note of everything. How he cut off women more often than men. How he barely listened to explanations, especially from young defendants. How quickly he dismissed claims of error. Then, an unexpected moment unfolded. A young white man, clearly nervous, approached the bench for a nearly identical citation to hers, speeding at 41 in a 35 miles per hour zone. His hands trembled as he held out his documents. Your Honor, I didn't mean to speed. I was running late to pick up my little sister. Judge Carter interrupted, but this time with a soft chuckle. Happens to the best of us. Got your sister's back, huh? The gallery chuckled politely. The young man nodded sheepishly. Yes, sir. Judge Carter glanced at the officer's notes and then, with no request for evidence or rebuttal, issued a small court fee and dismissed the fine. Just slow down next time. Court's adjourned for you, son. The difference in tone was unmistakable. Lena's eyes didn't leave the judge's face. The courtroom cleared slowly after a few more routine cases, until the judge announced a brief recess. Carter stood, speaking quietly to the clerk and bailiff. That's when he glanced toward the back again and noticed Lena still seated. He stepped down from the bench and made his way toward the exit, but veered suddenly toward her. Still here? he asked casually, his voice lower now, less performative. Didn't think a traffic case would warrant such lingering interest. Lena smiled politely. I take an interest in the legal process. Carter folded his arms. Well, you had your say. Case is over. Nothing personal, just court business. Understood, she replied evenly. I appreciate the reminder. There was a beat of silence. Something about her tone, courteous, yet cool, made him squint again. He couldn't place what was bothering him, but her composure didn't fit the profile he'd already written in his head. He tried again. You said you had footage? For your car? Yes, sir. Was it submitted through official court procedure? No, sir. You cut me off before I could file the motion. His jaw twitched. She could see it now, the cracks forming in his demeanor. He was starting to realize she wasn't who he thought. But he wasn't quite ready to backtrack. Not yet. Instead, he nodded stiffly and turned away. As he exited, Lena pulled out her phone and opened the voice memo app. She spoke quietly. Crestwood Municipal Court. Judge, Benjamin Carter. Traffic citation hearing. Disparity in case handling observed. Full transcript request advised. Immediate motion to vacate fine forthcoming. She saved the recording and slipped the phone back into her coat. The bailiff approached her a few minutes later. Ma'am, the courtroom's closed for the morning. I understand, she said, standing. Thank you. She offered a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The kind that said, you'll remember this moment later. She stepped out into the hallway, heels echoing, chin high. This had never been about a speeding ticket. Not really. It was about the assumptions made the moment she walked into that courtroom. The calculated dismissal, the casual bias, and the ingrained belief that she didn't belong at a legal table unless she was the one being judged. But Lena had spent her career making people regret underestimating her. And Judge Carter had just been added to the list. As she exited the courthouse into the hot afternoon sun, she made a silent promise. The next time I walk into that courtroom, I won't be sitting at the defendant's table. I'll be walking in with jurisdiction. The next morning, Lena sat in her office, the Washington, D.C. skyline rising in soft silhouettes through her high-rise window. The sun filtered through the blinds, but her focus was fixed not on the view, but on her laptop screen. She was reviewing Crestwood's municipal court records, pulling dockets, noting patterns, and looking for what she already suspected. A trend of dismissals for certain defendants and aggressive rulings for others. The previous day's hearing hadn't rattled her. It had clarified her course of action. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered casual bias cloaked in judicial authority. But it was the first time someone in such a position had stamped her dignity beneath the gavel, without even bothering to learn her name. Judge Carter didn't know who she was, and that wasn't just an oversight. It was the root of the problem. In his courtroom, she wasn't an Ivy League law graduate. She wasn't a seasoned federal prosecutor or a rising star in the Department of Justice. To him, she was just another case number with brown skin and attitude he thought needed correcting. And she had allowed him to think that, deliberately, Lena hadn't introduced herself during the hearing. Not out of humility, but out of calculation. She wanted to see how he'd behave when he thought no one important was watching. Because when people think you have no power, that's when they show you who they really are. Across the room, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her supervisor, U.S. Attorney Rachel Denton. Dent, heard about Crestwood. Is this about that ticket? Lena smirked and typed back. Lena, not anymore. Dent, need backup? Lena, no. Just a court recorder and a good suit. She ended the conversation there. This was something she needed to handle herself. By midday, she had submitted a formal request for the full court transcript from the hearing. She also drafted a complaint to the State Judicial Review Commission. Not an aggressive one, not yet, but a preliminary ethics inquiry requesting documentation of Judge Carter's handling of traffic cases over the past 18 months. She'd included anonymized data, case numbers, demographic observations, and notable discrepancies in sentencing patterns. The numbers didn't lie. Black and Hispanic defendants were fined and found guilty at nearly twice the rate of white defendants for similar violations under Carter's gavel. But she wasn't ready to go public. Not yet. She knew how this game worked. If she played the federal card too soon, it would become about her ego, a prosecutor flexing her power. If she made it about process and fairness, she could hold the mirror up without shouting. The truth would do the shouting for her. Lena spent the next few days gathering everything. Her own dashcam footage, her GPS logs, phone metadata showing her location and timestamp. All verifiable, all admissible. She had every right to contest that ticket, and Carter had trampled over those rights like they were debris on the floor. And she wasn't the only one. A quiet but critical piece of her preparation included a phone call to a young defense attorney named Aaron Vega, a public defender she'd met at a legal seminar 2 years prior. Aaron had spent part of his early career rotating through rural courtrooms, including, she'd learned, several stints in Crestwood. "I'm looking into Judge Carter," Lena told him. "I want to know how he operates when he thinks no one's watching." Aaron didn't hesitate. "He's a dinosaur," he said flatly. "Old school, old guard, and old-minded. I once had a kid get fined $600 for loitering. The same week, a local banker's son got caught driving drunk and got a $50 court fee." "You seeing a pattern?" "Crystal clear," she said. "You want names?" "No, not yet. Just context." Aaron chuckled. "You already have a plan, don't you?" "I do," Lena replied. "I'm just making sure I'm not the only one who saw what I saw." She ended the call and closed her laptop. She had all the proof she needed, of bias, of irregularity, of systemic inconsistency. But more than that, she had the calm, quiet knowledge of who she was, and what Carter had failed to recognize. There's a moment in every case, every confrontation, when power subtly changes hands. Most people miss it. Judge Carter had missed it, because Lena Wright, the woman he fined without hesitation, wasn't done. She was just getting started, and when she returned to his courtroom, she wouldn't need to say a word about who she was. Her presence, deliberate, prepared, and fully aware of her legal standing, would speak volumes. 2 weeks after the original hearing, Lena Wright returned to the Crestwood Municipal Courthouse, not as a passive defendant, but as a woman armed with clarity, evidence, and purpose. She didn't wear the standard black suit today. Instead, she chose a tailored navy blue, sharp lines, crisp collar, a quiet signal to anyone paying attention. "I am not who you thought I was." She entered the building with the same calm grace as before, but this time her steps had weight. Each echo down the corridor sounded less like hesitation and more like intent. She wasn't there to posture. She was there to dismantle, quietly, surgically, the flawed ruling that Judge Benjamin Carter had rendered with such offhand arrogance. Courtroom 2 buzzed with low conversation as she entered. Defendants waiting their turn whispered to their companions. A few glanced up as Lena walked in, recognizing her from last time. She moved toward the front and took a seat, not at the defendant's table, but behind it, in the first row, where attorneys usually waited to be called. Judge Carter hadn't entered yet. The clerk shuffled papers. The bailiff leaned against the far wall, sipping from a thermos. The mood was ordinary, routine. But Lena knew that was about to change. She had filed the motion to vacate the ruling 4 days earlier. A motion to reconsider, citing judicial misconduct, procedural negligence, and denial of due process. She hadn't flaunted her position, but she had included her title in the signature line, as required by court procedure. Lena R. Wright, Assistant United States Attorney. That was the moment the court staff realized who she was. The same woman who'd been dismissed without a second glance was now officially on the record as one of the federal government's senior prosecutors. And that changed everything. When Judge Carter finally entered, his robe swishing as he stepped up to the bench, the usual authority in his posture faltered for just a second. His eyes scanned the courtroom. They landed on Lena. There was a flicker. Recognition, tension. He cleared his throat. "We're reconvening on case 41582, Wright versus the town of Crestwood," he said, looking at his docket, but not before giving her a tight, brief glance. "Motion to vacate previous ruling has been submitted. Let's proceed." Lena stood. "Good morning, Your Honor." For the record, Lena Wright appearing on behalf of herself. "I'd like to formally request entry of supplemental evidence that was previously denied during my original appearance." The judge shifted in his seat. "I've read your motion," he said. "Lengthy. Thorough." She didn't smile. "Accuracy takes time." A quiet murmur passed through the room. "I see you also included footage," he continued, glancing down at the USB drive she had submitted with her filing. "Yes, sir. Dashcam video confirming I was traveling 37 miles per hour in a 35 zone, briefly, before decelerating. It also shows no visible signage indicating the limit drops from 40 to 35 in the area where the citation was issued, a violation of municipal traffic posting standards." She stepped forward and handed the clerk a printed transcription of her footage narration. Judge Carter scanned the first few lines, clearly growing uneasy. "And I've also submitted a digital time log," she continued, showing my precise arrival into the courthouse at 10:01 a.m., as well as security footage obtained via public records request that confirms the hallway delay you referenced as making excuses during my previous appearance. Silence. The weight of her preparation hung in the air like a sword suspended mid-swing. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses, but his composure was fraying. The controlled arrogance he once wielded was retreating behind a wall of procedural detachment. "I'll review the materials," he muttered, voice low. "Respectfully, Your Honor, with the evidence submitted and the procedural issues raised, I'm asking for immediate reversal of the original ruling and removal of the citation from my record." A long pause. Finally, he spoke. "The court will take it under advisement." It was a dodge, a delay tactic, one used when judges needed time to craft a face-saving response. But Lena was ready. "Sir," she said calmly, "as an officer of the court, I am required to report any appearance of judicial impropriety to the proper review board. I'd rather not escalate the matter. But denial of due process is not a clerical issue. It is a constitutional one." He stared at her, and there it was, the moment, the crack in the courtroom's illusion of power. When a judge who once spoke in dismissive tones now found himself facing someone who knew the rulebook better than he did. Lena hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't threatened. She had merely reminded him that her silence last time was a gift, one he no longer deserved. Finally, Judge Carter leaned back in his chair. "The fine is vacated," he said. "Citation dismissed. Record to be expunged." A pause. "I apologize if the previous ruling was rendered hastily." It was the closest thing he could offer to an admission of wrongdoing. Hollow, yes, but in this courtroom, from this man, it was thunder. Lena nodded once, collected her materials, and sat down. But as she did, she noticed the clerk glance at her with wide eyes, a look that said, "Who are you really?" And as always, Lena didn't answer with words. She let the silence and the judge's red face do the talking. The air in the courtroom lingered in a kind of stunned stillness, even after the judge's words had officially closed the matter. Judge Carter, red-faced and visibly rattled, quickly exited through his chambers, not offering another glance in Lena's direction. But the damage, or, depending on perspective, the justice, had already been done. Lena remained seated, calmly organizing her documents, deliberately unhurried. It wasn't theatrics. She simply believed in giving people time to digest uncomfortable truths. And judging by the expressions around her, they were still chewing. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Helen who had worked under Carter for nearly a decade, stood at her station with her hands frozen mid-motion above her keyboard. Her brow furrowed as she reread the judge's final entry in the docket. Fine vacated. Citation dismissed. Reason: procedural error and new evidence submission. It was sterile, devoid of detail, but Helen wasn't easily fooled. She knew what it really meant. We messed up. Big. The bailiff, usually impassive, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, casting slow glances between Lena and the judge's empty bench. There was a crease of thought in his forehead, something that hadn't been there before. In Crestwood Municipal Court, where cases were processed with conveyor belt speed and verdicts were rarely challenged, today's hearing had derailed the machinery. And the person responsible had done it without raising her voice once. Lena stood, finally, and walked toward the exit. As she reached the double doors, a soft voice stopped her. "Excuse me, Ms. Wright?" It was Helen, stepping cautiously around the clerk's desk. Her tone was curious, part hesitant, part reverent. "Yes," Lena replied, her voice still warm, unassuming. Helen approached slowly, eyes glancing to make sure the room was mostly empty. "You're a federal prosecutor?" "That's right." "I didn't know," Helen said quickly, her voice dropping. "I mean, we didn't know. The way the judge spoke to you. I just assumed you were another traffic case." "That's exactly what I wanted you to assume." Helen blinked, then half-smiled. "Well, it worked." Lena returned the smile. "It wasn't a trick. I just believe in watching how people behave when they don't think they're being watched." The bailiff had edged closer now, clearly listening. "Is this going to become a bigger thing?" he asked bluntly. Lena met his eyes. "That depends. I didn't come here to make waves. I came here to contest an unjust ruling. But what I saw, the way other cases were handled, how certain defendants were dismissed, others ridiculed, that's a pattern. And patterns matter." Helen looked down, visibly uncomfortable. "Judge Carter's been here a long time," she said, almost defensively. "He's old-fashioned, believes in firm courtrooms." "Firm isn't the issue," Lena said gently. "Bias is. Silence is." The bailiff shifted, as if weighing something internally. Then he said, "You're not the first person to get treated like that. You're just the first one who could do something about it." "I'm not the only one who can do something," Lena replied, her voice low but firm. "You all see it every day. You have more power than you think." Helen opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Lena could see the weight of years behind her eyes. Years of seeing, hearing, recording, and complying. "I'm not here to get anyone fired," Lena added. "But I am here to start a conversation, because people trust courtrooms to be the last line of fairness. And if a judge uses that bench to cut corners or push biases, the whole system crumbles beneath it." Helen gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Will you be filing an ethics complaint?" "I already have." "Preliminary. Respectful. Thorough." The words hung in the air. Respectful, but thorough. Just like her. As Lena turned to leave, Helen spoke once more. "I hope you come back." Lena looked over her shoulder, eyebrows raised. "I mean, not as a defendant," Helen added with a nervous chuckle, "but maybe as someone in that seat." She gestured toward the bench. "We need people like you there." Lena smiled, but said nothing. She pushed through the doors and stepped into the hallway, where the chatter of other cases resumed in the distance. But behind her, the silence she left in that courtroom said more than anything she could have spoken. It had unsettled the order, not through protest, not through power plays, but through truth presented calmly, precisely, and by a woman who refused to be defined by the assumptions of others. She had walked into that courtroom alone. Now, others were watching and thinking. In the days following Lena Wright's quiet courtroom victory, something subtle began to shift in the small town of Crestwood. Not in headlines or press releases, but in conversation, in body language, in the way courthouse staff looked at each other when a case was called. The change began as whispers. It started with Helen, the longtime court clerk. She didn't say much, but people noticed how her demeanor had changed. More cautious, more attentive when she read out case numbers. She no longer smirked when a defendant nervously explained their lateness. Instead, she listened. She paused, and when others in the courtroom mocked or dismissed those trying to speak, she seemed uncomfortable in a way she never had before. The bailiff, too, Marcus, had begun arriving early, sitting in silence before the morning docket. He watched Judge Carter more closely now. Not out of loyalty, but scrutiny. For the first time, he found himself replaying moments from past cases. The sarcastic tone Carter had used with a single mother pleading for leniency, the harsh scolding of a teenage boy who showed up without a belt, the outright dismissal of a Spanish-speaking defendant who struggled to understand English and was denied a translator. It had all seemed routine before. Now it didn't. The whisper network grew outside the courtroom too. Local attorneys began murmuring about the hearing. Someone had told someone who told someone else that the woman with the speeding ticket was actually a federal prosecutor. Word spread fast in a town like Crestwood, where the legal community was small and tight-knit. She wiped the floor with Carter. One junior attorney told a colleague over lunch at a nearby cafe. Didn't raise her voice once. Just walked in, laid down the law, and made him look like a fool. Is it true he dismissed the fine and apologized? Another asked. Swallowed every word. Full reversal. But with the admiration came fear. If she could do that, what would happen next? In the halls of the municipal building, Judge Carter's staff moved with visible tension. He, once untouchable in his self-appointed authority, had grown quieter in court. His jokes fell flatter. His rulings were more cautious, sometimes even wavering. He seemed constantly aware of who was in the room, especially if the gallery held anyone unfamiliar. At a local bar association meeting the following week, Lena's name came up again. She didn't even pull rank, said Aaron Vega. The public defender Lena had consulted. Didn't have to. She let his behavior indict itself. A few nodded solemnly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One older attorney muttered, "He's been doing this for years. This ain't news." But another, a younger black attorney named Simone James, shot back. "Just because it's old news doesn't mean it's not still a problem." And she did what most of us wish we could have done. Simone had been on the receiving end of Carter's withering judgments before. Once publicly shamed for bringing feelings into a legal argument during a tenant rights case. The whisper network became a current, carrying quiet energy through the halls of law enforcement, into city offices and across defense firms. And it didn't stop at legal circles. Local activists picked up on it too. A small but vocal group called Crestwood Justice Watch, which monitored public cases and advocated for transparency in court proceedings, began investigating Lena's case. They submitted FOIA requests for docket logs, videos, and ruling patterns. Within 2 weeks, they were compiling a dossier, not for retaliation, but for reform. At the same time, Lena was receiving discreet messages, some anonymous, others from known attorneys and staff. One read, "Thank you for what you did. He's been getting away with this for years." Another, "If you need a list of names, we've got them." And perhaps the most telling came from a former intern. "I used to feel powerless in his courtroom. Watching you stand your ground reminded me why I went to law school in the first place." Lena responded only to the last one, and simply with, "That's why I stood my ground." Back in D.C., Lena continued her work in silence, declining interview requests and ignoring the growing media interest. She hadn't come to Crestwood for fame or headlines. She'd come because the law matters, especially when, it's applied unfairly. She knew better than anyone. The real impact wasn't in the verdict, but in the echo it left behind. Because the court of public opinion, the court of conscience, was still in session, and the whispers in Crestwood had become something more than gossip. They were the early sounds of accountability. For years, Crestwood had been a quiet town. Not silent, just subdued. The kind of place where people didn't stir the pot unless it boiled over. Where injustice didn't make headlines, it made habits. People accepted things, because challenging them often came at too high a cost. The courtroom was no exception. It wasn't just a place where traffic tickets were processed. It was where power resided, wrapped in robes and ritual. But in the weeks following Lena Wright's courtroom appearance, something unusual happened. People began to talk, openly. It began on a neighborhood Facebook group, where a user posted a blurry photo of Lena walking into the courthouse captioned, "This woman just took on Judge Carter, and won. Anyone else have a story about him?" Within an hour, the thread exploded. A mother wrote, "He fined my son $400 for forgetting his registration papers at home. He was 17. First ticket ever. Treated him like a criminal." A teacher chimed in, "Same judge laughed in my face when I asked for leniency after missing court due to the flu. Called me irresponsible." Then came a string of more troubling stories, mostly from Black and Latino residents, about disproportionately high fines, public scoldings, and cases that never seemed to get a fair hearing. Suddenly, what had always been whispered behind closed doors became part of public discourse. Local radio picked up the buzz. During a Friday morning call-in show on Crestwood AM 620, the topic of Judge Carter consumed the entire hour. "She made him look foolish, and she didn't even raise her voice," one caller said. Another added, "If she hadn't been a federal prosecutor, he would have steamrolled her like he does the rest of us." What does that say about this town? The host, clearly taken aback by the volume of calls, asked a question that would ripple for days afterward. How long have we allowed respect to be mistaken for fear? Church groups began holding discussions. Community centers quietly passed around flyers, encouraging residents to document and report any questionable rulings or conduct in Carter's courtroom. Even high school civics teachers started discussing the case with their students, not as a scandal, but as an example of how power responds to accountability. At the local cafe near the courthouse, where Judge Carter was once a regular, his usual table sat empty. The owner, a wiry woman named Marie, told customers flatly, "He hasn't shown up since that prosecutor came through. Guess he's not used to being questioned." It wasn't just those who had clashed with the judge who spoke up. Some of his defenders, those who had benefited from his leniency or shared his worldview, tried to frame the issue as a misunderstanding. He was just doing his job. One city councilman said in a brief statement to the local paper, "We shouldn't rush to judgment over one bad day." But by then, it wasn't about one bad day. It was about a culture that had been exposed, and Lena Wright's silent defiance had cracked open something deeper than a single case. It had given the town permission to confront its own reflection. Even teenagers were aware. A group of high school seniors began filming a short documentary titled Judged, interviewing residents who had appeared before Carter, and collecting stories for a class project that soon gained traction on YouTube. One particularly moving moment showed an older black man in his 60s, speaking into the camera. "I've been in that courtroom 3 times in my life. Each time, I walked out feeling smaller than when I went in. Not because I broke the law, but because of how he looked at me, like I didn't belong there unless I was guilty." People began asking questions at town hall meetings. Uncomfortable questions about oversight, about judicial reviews, about whether power should go unchecked behind a bench. And while Judge Carter remained tight-lipped, his silence now spoke volumes. No official statement, no public comment, just retreat. He had underestimated a woman he thought was just another defendant. But what he failed to grasp was that Lena hadn't stood up just for herself. She'd stood up for everyone who had never been given the chance to speak. Her act of resistance wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational. It was lawful, poised, impeccably prepared. And for a community long accustomed to injustice wrapped in routine, that kind of resistance was revolutionary. People who once felt invisible had seen themselves reflected in her calm defiance. And now, Crestwood, slowly, reluctantly, was starting to look at itself in the mirror. The complaint began quietly, just as Lena intended. It wasn't delivered with fanfare or through the press. It came in the form of a simple typed letter. 14 pages of calm, factual documentation, filed with the Judicial Conduct Review Board of the state of Virginia. Her cover page didn't scream for attention. It simply read, Formal complaint regarding judicial misconduct. Judge Benjamin Carter, Crestwood Municipal Court. Inside, Lena laid out the facts. She didn't embellish. She didn't speculate. She didn't even recount her own emotional response to the encounter. Instead, she submitted a timeline of her court appearance and original citation, dashcam footage and GPS logs, transcripts of the hearing, a list of procedural violations, including the judge's refusal to view submitted evidence, a signed affidavit noting his dismissive language and failure to uphold courtroom standards of fairness. She cited not only legal precedent but ethical codes, referencing Canon 3b-5 of the Code of Judicial Conduct, which states that a judge shall perform judicial duties without bias or prejudice. And perhaps most powerfully, she included something else. Anonymized testimony from 5 other individuals who had contacted her after her story spread. Each account painted a picture of a pattern. Defendants interrupted mid-sentence, evidence denied without review, unbalanced sentencing for similar infractions based on race or class. She submitted the packet on a Friday morning. No press release, no noise, but the system noticed. By Monday afternoon, the state board confirmed receipt. By Wednesday, they initiated a preliminary investigation. This step, while procedural, sent ripples through the legal community. Judicial complaints are rarely taken seriously unless accompanied by substantial evidence. But Lena's complaint was different, precise, restrained, and impeccably sourced. The kind of complaint that couldn't be ignored. Behind closed doors, the review board convened. Its members, a panel of retired judges, attorneys, and citizen representatives, met in a private session to review the materials. They didn't discuss feelings. They discussed facts. One board member, a retired appellate judge, reportedly said, "This reads less like a complaint and more like a prosecutorial memo. She knows exactly how to build a case, and she just built one against a sitting judge." Meanwhile, back in Crestwood, Judge Carter received a confidential notice of inquiry. It landed on his desk just after lunch. He read it alone in his chambers, the walls feeling smaller now, the silence heavier. His hands trembled slightly as he set the letter down. It informed him that a formal investigation had begun and that his courtroom conduct would be under review. He had been warned to refrain from presiding over any cases involving Lena Wright, or any matter that resembled the one under complaint, until the investigation concluded. To the outside world, he continued his duties, but his posture had changed. His rulings became clipped. He leaned more heavily on the clerk. His voice, once booming and confident, now quavered at times. Court staff noticed. So did the public, and word of the investigation leaked. Not through Lena, but through the same community that had been whispering for weeks. Local papers picked it up. State board investigates Crestwood judge after prosecutor's complaint. Community advocates called for greater transparency, demanding a review of Carter's case history. One local councilwoman issued a statement urging the city to temporarily suspend him from the bench until the investigation concluded. Behind the scenes, Lena remained silent. She didn't do interviews. She didn't post on social media. She let the system work because she still believed in it. And while she understood that complaints like hers didn't always lead to removal, she also knew this wasn't just about punishment. It was about precedent, because for every judge who abused their discretion without consequence, there were hundreds of defendants who'd lost faith in the system altogether. And Lena, Wright, was determined to give them a reason to believe again. The investigation would take weeks, possibly months, but it had started, and once a complaint is in motion, especially one this meticulously prepared, it becomes more than a document. It becomes a question that can't be unasked. 6 weeks after Lena, Wright, filed her complaint, the day of reckoning finally arrived. The courtroom looked the same on the surface. The same polished wood panels, the same subdued lighting, the same echo of footsteps against marble tile. But the air felt different, heavier, expectant. Word had spread that Judge Benjamin Carter's review was complete, and though the state hadn't released its findings to the public yet, whispers circulated that he'd requested to make a personal statement from the bench. His first public words since the incident. The gallery was full. Lawyers, reporters, community leaders, a few of the very people who had once sat before him as defendants, now here as witnesses. And Lena, she sat in the back row, inconspicuous in a navy blazer and dark-rimmed glasses, hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't come to gloat. She came for closure. When Judge Carter entered the courtroom, he looked thinner, paler. His once unshakable confidence had withered under the scrutiny. He no longer walked like a man untouchable. He walked like a man weighed down by a reckoning long overdue. He adjusted his robe, cleared his throat, and began. "I have served as a judge in this community for 26 years, he said, voice gravelly but steady. And in that time, I've made thousands of rulings, overseen countless hearings, and held firm to what I believed was the rule of law." A pause. "But belief, I've come to understand, is not always enough. The law is not a shield for temperament, nor a sword for ego. It is a promise, a sacred one, and I failed to uphold it." The room shifted, eyebrows lifted. Lena remained still. He continued, "I misjudged a woman in this courtroom. I treated her with contempt before I knew her name, her story, or her role in the justice system. I assumed she was beneath me. And in doing so, I betrayed everything that seat is supposed to stand for." No one spoke. No one moved. "I've read every page of the complaint she filed," Carter said, his voice quieter now. "And I've reviewed my own record, my own footage. And I must admit what I've long denied. I've let my own biases shape my behavior from this bench." A breath. Those who appeared before me and left feeling belittled, unheard, or unjustly punished. I cannot undo that harm. But I can acknowledge it. From the back of the room, Helen, the clerk, wiped her eyes. The bailiff stood straighter than usual. The entire room, usually buzzing with paperwork and distractions, had gone absolutely still. Carter swallowed hard. The Judicial Conduct Review Board has completed its investigation. I have agreed to step down from this bench, effective immediately. I will not seek reappointment. I will not appeal their findings. I will accept them. Shock rippled through the gallery. Not gasps, not drama, just a collective tightening of breath. "I make this decision not out of pressure," he added, "but because it is right. Justice cannot be demanded from others if we cannot demand it of ourselves." He looked up, directly at Lena. "I owe Ms. Wright an apology, not just as a professional, but as a citizen who deserved the same dignity I should have offered to anyone in this room. Lena gave a slight nod. Nothing more. With trembling fingers, Carter reached for his gavel. For the last time. "This court," he said slowly, "is adjourned." And with that, he brought the gavel down one final time. A verdict not rendered against a defendant, but against himself. As people rose from the gallery, no one rushed out. There were no cheers, no applause. Just quiet, the kind that follows something profound, a kind of sacred silence. Lena stood last. She didn't approach the bench. She didn't speak to the press. She walked out the front doors the same way she had walked in. Alone, composed and unshaken. But what she left behind was louder than any statement she could have made. She hadn't just won a case. She had reminded an entire community, and a judge, that the courtroom belongs to the people. All people, regardless of what they wear, what they drive, or what assumptions others carry about the color of their skin. In a place where verdicts are handed down daily, today's was different. Today, justice wasn't issued to a defendant. It was delivered to the system itself,